There are two boxes on a hospital admission form that use the same word. One of them says father, the other one says father step. They sit about half an inch apart on the page and they look like nothing at all, like the kind of line a clerk fills in without ever glancing up from the screen. But whichever of those two boxes has a working phone number in it is the box that decides who gets the call at 9 o'clock at night, who is allowed through the double doors when the doors are locked, and who stands out in a parking lot in October listening to a helicopter spool up with his own kid inside it. I'm Nathan, and this one is about a man who found out that the distance between those two boxes is not love and it is not blood, it is administrative, which sounds like the coldest sentence I could possibly say to you, until you turn it over and look at the other side of it. Because anything that gets decided administratively can also be undecided administratively, by somebody who happens to know which piece of paper actually matters. Gabriel Waddell spent 19 years loading other people's children into helicopters. He was extremely good at it, and on a Saturday in October, in his own son's hospital, he found out he was a checkbox nobody had ticked. Ottersville, Indiana, sits on a shelf of good black bottomland inside a slow bend of the Wabash, and the two structures that define it are the grain elevator and the hospital. The elevator is taller. The hospital is more important, and everybody in Kinlow County knows it, because the next inpatient bed in any direction is 58 miles away, and the road that gets you there is a 2-lane that floods twice a year. Gabriel Waddell was 43 years old, and he serviced medical equipment for a living. That is the plain version of it. The longer version is that he was a biomedical equipment technician under contract to a company out of Indianapolis that maintained the machines at 6 rural hospitals, and Ashbury Memorial in Ottersville was 2 days of his month, every month, for 6 years. He knew that building the way a man knows a boat he has bailed out. He knew that the second-floor infusion pumps drifted about 2% slow in the winter because the supply closet backed onto an exterior wall. He knew the freight elevator would not close its door if you loaded it past the yellow line, and he knew which of the 2 autoclaves you could trust. He knew the janitors' names, all of them, and the name of the woman who ran the sterile processing department, and the name of her daughter. Before that, he had been in the Army, and the part of the Army he had been in was air ambulance. 19 years, most of it as a flight paramedic, the last stretch of it as the man who trained the ones who did it after him. He had knelt on a lot of floors that were moving. He had put his thumb into a lot of holes. He got out because a hard landing in a training rotation compressed 2 vertebrae and gave him a left hand that went numb below 45 degrees, which is a small thing to lose and a disqualifying thing to lose, both at once. He did not talk about any of it much. When people at the hospital asked him what he had done before, he said he used to work on the other end of the ambulance, and then he asked them about their machine. His son was Jameson, and Jameson was 9. Jameson had his mother's chin and a cowlick that no barber in the county had ever defeated, and he was in that specific stage of 9 where a boy narrates his own life out loud in the third person and finds himself hilarious. He collected bottle caps, not for any reason. He had a coffee can of them, and he would tell you, unprompted and at length, which ones were rare, and none of them were rare. Gabriel and Joanna had been married for 12 years. She had not left him for anybody, and she had not left him because he was cruel. And Gabriel, to his enormous credit, never once told the story any other way. She had left him because 19 years of a man being extraordinary somewhere else is 19 years of a woman being ordinary at home, alone, with the porch light on, and because the 2 of them had run out of ways to be in the same room. It ended in a lawyer's office in Ottersville over about 90 minutes, and it was polite, and it hurt worse for being polite. She kept the house on Kettering Street. He took the shop behind his mother's place and made an apartment out of the upper half of it, and he got Jameson every other weekend and half the summer, and the arrangement worked because both of them wanted it to. Then, 23 months after the decree, Joanna married a man named Creighton Denniston, and everything about Gabriel's life stayed exactly the same on paper and changed completely in every other way. The last thing you need to know about Gabriel Waddell before this story starts moving is a piece of ground. In 1962, his grandmother, Almeda Waddell, was a registered nurse working out of a clinic room above the feed store, and the county was trying to build itself a hospital. They had a bond issue and a federal match and no land, because the only flat, well-drained, non-flooding 26 acres inside the town limits belonged to the Waddells, and the Waddells farmed it. Almeida's husband wanted to sell it outright and be done. Almeida would not let him. She was 52 years old. She had spent her working life watching farm kids get hauled to Terre Haute in the back of a neighbor's truck, and she had one clear idea in her head about what a hospital was for. So instead of a sale, the family gave the county a ground lease. 99 years, $1 a year. The hospital association would own every brick and stick they built on it, in perpetuity, and the Waddells would own the dirt underneath. And Almeida, who had never been to law school and who wrote in a slanted hand that leaned so far forward it looked like it was walking, made the county's attorney put 3 things into that lease before she would sign it. The first was that the ground was leased for a hospital, and if the buildings on it ever stopped being licensed to keep a child overnight, the landlord could call the whole thing back in with a year's notice. The second was that the landlord, once a year, could demand copies of every license, certificate, permit, and insurance binder the hospital held, and the hospital had to hand them over inside 30 days. The third was the one the county attorney argued about hardest and lost. The landlord, or whoever the landlord named, held a permanent non-voting seat at any meeting of the hospital's governing body, and had the right to be recognized and to be heard. The attorney told her it was unusual. Almeida told him she was aware of that. Nobody had thought about any of it in 60 years. Almeida died in 1994. Gabriel's mother, Nadine, administered the little shell company that held the dirt, the Waddell Field Company, the way you administer a birdhouse. And after her stroke, Gabriel took it over, which in practice meant one thing. Every January, he wrote a check for $1 to Ashbury Memorial Hospital and mailed it, and felt vaguely ridiculous doing it. And every February, a large envelope came back to him by certified mail, from the compliance office of the hospital, containing whatever it was they were contractually obliged to send him. Gabriel had never opened one. Not ever. They went into a plastic tub on the shelf above the parts washer in his shop, still sealed. 3 of them by the autumn this story happens in, because a man who fixes infusion pumps for a living does not sit down at his kitchen table on a Tuesday and read a hospital's insurance binder for fun. That tub is going to matter later. I want you to know it was up there the whole time, unopened, gathering shop dust, while everything else in this story went wrong. Creighton Denniston arrived in Ottersville 3 years before Jameson went over the handlebars, and he arrived as the answer to a genuine emergency. Ashbury Memorial in those days was 26 days from closing. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not an exaggeration for effect. The board had a memo with that number on it. The hospital had eaten through its reserve. Its obstetrics unit was running 7 deliveries a month at a cost that would have made a bond trader weep. Its billing department had a coding error in it that had been quietly failing to collect on a whole category of outpatient claims for 2 years. And the previous chief executive was a decent man from Ottersville who had been promoted up from finance and who was, by every account including his own, drowning. The board went outside for the first time in the hospital's history and hired Creighton Denniston out of a system in Ohio. And Creighton Denniston came in and, over about 7 months, saved the place. I want to be careful here, because it would be easier to tell you this story if he had been a fraud. He was not a fraud. He was very good. He closed the obstetrics unit, which made him hated for exactly 1 winter, and he was right to do it. He found the coding error and clawed back a sum of money that no one in that building had believed was recoverable. He renegotiated the anesthesia contract. He talked the state into a rural transformation grant by writing an application so clean that the state used it as a sample for other applicants. He walked the halls. He learned the janitors' names too. When the elevator inspector red-tagged the freight car, Creighton had it fixed in 9 days rather than the 60 the previous administration would have taken, and he stood in the car himself when they signed it off, because that is the kind of thing he understood. He was 47. He was tall in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, and he had the specific gift of being able to say a warm sentence about the community while looking at a person in that community as though they were a line on a spreadsheet that had not yet been formatted. He believed, sincerely and completely, that he was the hero of Kinlow County, and the maddening thing, the thing that makes this story worth telling, is that he had a real claim to it. The trouble with a man like that is that saving something once teaches him that whatever he does next is also saving it. Here is what he did next. Rural hospitals live and die on what the industry calls the case mix, which is a bloodless way of saying what kind of patients walk through your door and are they the kind you get paid to keep. Adult medicine, Ashbury had. Emergency, Ashbury had. What Ashbury did not have, and what the grant money and the market and the local pride all pointed toward, was children. So Creighton built a pediatric line. He put in a 6-bed pediatric inpatient unit with murals on the walls, a fish tank in the corridor, and a name, Ashbury Kids. He put it on a billboard on the state road. He put it in the annual report and on the side of the hospital's own transport van. And he signed the hospital up to a set of arrangements that made the word pediatric legally usable in all of that marketing. The arrangements were these: a telemedicine contract with a pediatric critical care group in Indianapolis, which meant a screen on a cart, a written transfer agreement with Shelburne Children's Hospital, 58 miles away, which meant a phone number, and a coverage arrangement under which the hospital's general surgeons, of whom there were 2, and one of them was 63 years old, would take pediatric surgical call. None of that was illegal. Half the small hospitals in America run on some version of it, and a screen on a cart at 2 in the morning has saved more children than it has hurt. It becomes something else only when you begin to describe it, on paper, to the state, as something it is not, and then build your incentives on top of the description. Creighton married Joanna Waddell 14 months before the accident, in a small ceremony at a golf club in Shelburne, and he moved into the house on Kettering Street. And he was, it has to be said, decent to Jameson. He took him to a minor league game. He bought him a bicycle, a real one, and taught him to true the wheel. Gabriel, who is not a saint and was not pretending to be one, sat in his shop that spring with his jaw tight and let his son have a bicycle from another man. That is what he did with it. He let it happen and he said nothing, because the alternative was a 9-year-old learning to carry his father's feelings around, and Gabriel had decided a long time ago that his son was not going to be anybody's luggage. The Saturday was the 12th of October, and it was one of those Indiana days that borrows a week from September, 72 degrees and gold, and every kid in Ottersville was outdoors on it. Jameson and Omar Hendershot rode the levee path, which runs from the boat ramp up past the elevator and out to where the county mows it and then stops mowing it. Omar was 10 and a half and had the confidence of a boy with an older brother. They were riding down the back side of the levee, where the maintenance road drops off toward the drainage cut, and Jameson hit the lip of a washout at a speed that his front wheel did not agree with. He went over the bars. He came down on the bike, and the end of the handlebar, the rubber grip torn off it 2 weeks earlier, the bare steel tube of it, went into his upper abdomen just below the ribs on the left. He got up. That is the whole cruelty of this particular injury, and any pediatric surgeon in the country will tell you the same thing with the same flat face. The child gets up. Jameson got up, said a word he had learned from his father, brushed the grit off his palms, straightened the front wheel between his knees the way Creighton had taught him, and rode home. Omar rode with him and did not think anything of it, because there was nothing to think. He was at the house on Kettering Street by 2:30. He ate a sandwich. He watched half of a movie. At around 4, he told his mother his stomach hurt, and she gave him an antacid tablet and told him to lie down, which is exactly what 999 parents out of 1,000 would do. And Joanna Deniston has had to live with that ever since, and it was not her fault. At 6:15, she went in to check on him, and he was gray. He was gray, and he was sweating, and he was lying very still on his side, with his knees drawn up, and when she put her hand on his belly, he screamed in a register she had never heard out of him in 9 years. The handlebar had crushed his pancreas against his spine and torn it. There was a duodenal hematoma packing itself under it. He was bleeding slowly into a place that does not tell you it is bleeding until it has been doing it for a long time. Joanna put him in the car and drove him to Ashbury Memorial, and she got him into that emergency department at 6:41 in the evening, and I want to be exactly fair here. From 6:41 until about 7:15, that hospital did everything right. The triage nurse took one look at the boy's color and did not send him to the waiting room. The emergency physician on that night was a locum out of Fort Wayne named Dr. Linwood Ellery, and Ellery was sharp. He had the boy's shirt off in 90 seconds, found the seatbelt sign bruise coming up across the epigastrium like a thumbprint, and said the two words that should have decided the entire rest of this story. He said, handlebar injury. He got an IV in. He got fluids running. He got a lipase and an amylase drawn, and he did not wait for them. He got the boy into the scanner at 7:02, and by 7:15, he was standing in the reading room with the radiologist, looking at a transection through the neck of a 9-year-old's pancreas and free fluid in the belly, and he picked up the phone to call the on-call surgeon, and that is where this hospital stopped doing everything right. The on-call surgeon was Dr. Maynard Jolliffe, 63 years old, 31 years in Ottersville, a good general surgeon and a decent man who had taken out more gallbladders than most people have had dinners. He came in from his house in 18 minutes, which is fast. He looked at the images, and he said, out loud, in front of 2 nurses, the most honest sentence spoken by anybody in that building that night. He said, I have not put my hands on a pancreas that size since my fellowship, and that was 1989. That should have ended it. The protocol, written down, approved, signed, sitting in a binder 40 feet from where he was standing, said that a pediatric patient requiring surgical management beyond the capability of the on-call surgeon is transferred immediately to Shelburne Children's under the transfer agreement, and that the transfer is initiated by the on-call surgeon, and that nobody's permission is required to initiate it. At 7:22, Dr. Jolliffe called Creighton Deniston. He did not call him for permission. He would say that later, to the state, and I believe him. He called him because Deniston was the chief executive, because Deniston's stepson was the patient, and because in a town of that size you call the boy's family before you put him on an aircraft. Creighton Deniston took that call standing on a flagstone terrace at a donor's home in Shelburne, holding a glass of wine, at a dinner for the capital campaign for the second phase of Ashbury Kids. And here is where a man's whole character walks out into the light and stands there. He asked good questions. He asked what the scan showed, and he asked what the boy's pressure was, and he asked whether he was stable, and Jolliffe said stable, for now. And Creighton heard the words for now the way a man hears the part of a sentence he already wanted to hear. And then Creighton Deniston said this, Maynard, don't put him on a helicopter yet. Work him up. If he's stable, let's take our time and be sure. Because if we fly every belly pain out of that building, we don't have a program, we have a bus stop. Then he said he'd be there in an hour. Then he hung up, and he went back inside, and he gave a 6-minute speech about how a child in Kinlow County should never have to leave Kinlow County to be taken care of, and the room applauded him, and he meant every word of it. 3 hours and 12 minutes elapsed between the moment Dr. Ellery said handlebar injury and the moment the flight crew from Shelburne lifted off the pad at Ashbury Memorial with Gabriel Waddell on board. You want to know what happened inside those 3 hours and 12 minutes, because it sounds impossible, and it is not impossible at all. It is ordinary. It is what happens in buildings when the person at the top has made his preference known and has never once had to say it as an order. At 7:30, Dr. Jolliffe ordered a repeat scan with different timing on the contrast, which was medically defensible and clinically useless, and which took 40 minutes to get and read. At 8:10, the telemedicine cart was wheeled into the bay, and a pediatric intensivist in Indianapolis appeared on the screen. He was good. He looked at the images that had been pushed to him, and he said, and this is in the recording, this is a surgical pancreas. Who's flying him? And somebody off camera said they were working on it, and the intensivist, who had 6 other screens that night in 6 other towns, said fine, keep me posted, and went dark. At 8:40, the transfer coordinator, a woman named Rachel Hendershot, Omar's mother, the same Omar who had ridden home beside Jameson that afternoon and who was at that moment eating dinner at her kitchen table not knowing any of it. Rachel Hendershot began the transfer packet. She got Shelburne on the line, and Shelburne accepted the patient in under 2 minutes, which is what Shelburne always did. She had the acceptance at 8:46, and then she was told to hold. Not by Creighton. Creighton was in his car by then. She was told to hold by the house supervisor, who had been told by Dr. Jolliffe, who had been told by the chief executive not to put him on a helicopter yet. The night charge nurse on the pediatric side was a woman named Ernestine Ruffner, 61 years old, 34 years in that building, and she is the second most important person in this story. Ernestine Ruffner had been through 6 administrations. She had watched the obstetrics unit close, and she had agreed with closing it. She was not a crusader. and she had never filed anything against anybody in her life. What she was a nurse of a specific old-fashioned kind who had never in her career been able to stand still while a clock ran on a child. At 9 o'clock, when the boy's heart rate came up and his pressure came down and somebody hung a second bag, Ernestine Ruffner looked at the clock on the wall of that bay, and then she looked at the whiteboard where the transfer status was written, and where somebody had written accepted, hold per admin in blue marker, and she took out her phone and photographed the whiteboard. She would tell the state investigator, months later, that she did not know why she did it. She said she had a feeling that this was a night somebody was going to lie about. At 9:20, Rachel Hendershot went out to her car in the staff lot, sat in it with the door shut, and called Gabriel Waddell. Gabriel was in his shop with a bed motor on the bench and the radio on. Rachel Hendershot said, "Gabriel, is anybody there with you?" And he put the wrench down, because in his old life, that was the first sentence of a specific kind of conversation. She told him his son had been in the emergency department for 2.5 hours with a torn pancreas. She told him Shelburne had accepted him at 8:46. She told him the boy was still in the building. She did not tell him why, because she liked her job and she had 2 kids and a mortgage. And she said, "I'm not on this call." And Gabriel said, "You were never on this call." And he was already reaching for his keys. Here is the thing that Gabriel would come back to over and over in the following weeks, turning it around in his hands like a part that had failed for no visible reason. It was 9:20 at night, and he was hearing this from his son's friend's mother, in a parked car, in a whisper. Joanna had not called him. Joanna, sitting in a plastic chair in a bay with her hand on her son's ankle, had asked Creighton at about 7 o'clock whether he had called Gabriel, and Creighton had said, "I'll take care of it." And Joanna, in the worst hours of her life, had believed him, because that is what you do with the man you married when he tells you he has handled something. Creighton Denniston never called Gabriel Waddell. Not at 7, not at 8, not at 9. He did not forget. Forgetting would be a better explanation than the true one, which is that Creighton Denniston had done a piece of arithmetic in his head on the drive-in from Shelburne and had concluded that the one person in Kinlow County who could look at a transfer clock and know exactly what it meant was the boy's father, and that the longer that man stayed in his shop, the better this night was going to look in the morning. Gabriel Waddell got to Ashbury Memorial at 10:58 at night. He came in off the state road with his hazards on and left his truck in the fire lane, and he came up the front walk toward the main entrance, which is glassed in, with a low run of 9 concrete steps and a rail down the middle, and pea gravel in the beds on both sides. The doors at that hour are locked and staffed, and standing inside them, on the phone, in a charcoal suit with the tie gone, was Creighton Denniston, who saw him coming across the lot and hung up and came out through the doors to meet him on the steps. Gabriel said, "Where is my son?" And Creighton Denniston, who had a helicopter inbound, a chief of staff to manage, a donor dinner still on his breath and a night to get through, made the single decision that ended his career, though it would take him 7 months to understand that it had. He put his hand flat on Gabriel Waddell's chest. "Stay in the parking lot, soldier boy," he said. "Fathers like you don't come inside." And he shoved him. Gabriel Waddell went down the last 3 steps backward and sat down hard in the gravel bed at the bottom, and the palms of both hands went into the pea gravel and took the skin off. I have thought about that shove a lot, because it is a small thing. A man in a suit pushes a man in a work jacket, and the man in the work jacket sits down in some rocks. Nobody breaks. In the security footage, it lasts about 1.5 seconds and it is almost comic. But here is what it actually was. Creighton Denniston was standing at the top of 9 steps, inside a building his own grant application had described as belonging to the people of Kinlow County, telling a man who had spent 19 years pulling children out of wrecked cars that his category of father was not admitted here. He was not making a threat. Threats are a negotiation. He was making a classification. He was sorting a man into a bin, the way you sort a form into a box, and he did it in front of a security guard and a valet stand and a camera, without lowering his voice, because it genuinely did not occur to him that anybody in that parking lot outranked him. Gabriel got up. He looked at his hands, and he wiped the gravel off them on his jeans, one and then the other, slowly. Then he said, "Is he going to Shelburne?" That is what he asked. Not what you would expect. and not what most men would have asked, and it is the sentence that tells you who he was. And Creighton, who had already realized in some back room of himself that he had gone too far, said, "The aircraft is 15 minutes out," and stepped back inside, and the doors locked behind him. Two sheriff's deputies who had been called for something else in the ER lot came over, and one of them was a man Gabriel had gone to school with, and that deputy stood beside him and said, quietly, "You want to go around to the ambulance bay and I don't see you?" And Gabriel said no, because he was not going to give that man one single thing to write down. So he stood in the parking lot. He stood there, and he heard the aircraft come in over the elevator from the northeast, and he knew the airframe by the sound of it before he could see it, and he watched the flight crew come out of the ship and go inside with the stretcher, and he stood in the dark, 40 yards away, a 19-year flight paramedic, and watched other people load his own son. They lifted at 11:40. And Gabriel Waddell could not go on that aircraft, and could not follow it in his truck as far as the door of the receiving hospital, and be let in at the other end, because on the admission form completed at 6:41 that evening, in the box marked Father, there was no phone number, and in the box marked Father, Step, there was Creighton Deniston's cell. Dr. Zaida Gaynor took Jameson Waddell into an operating room at Shelburne Children's at 12:50 in the morning, and did not come out until 5:40. He lived. I am going to tell you that here, rather than make you carry it, because you have been carrying it since the handlebar. He lived. What she had to do to make that true was take the tail of his pancreas and his spleen, wash out a belly that had been marinating for 9 hours, place 3 drains, and leave a wound she could not close for 2 days. He was on a ventilator until Tuesday. He was fed through a line for 19 days. He was in Shelburne for 7 weeks, and he came home in December with a scar from his sternum to below his navel that a 9-year-old boy in Indiana is going to be explaining at pool parties for the rest of his life. Gabriel drove the 58 miles and was standing at the desk at Shelburne when the sun came up. Nobody there had any idea who he was supposed to be, so they treated him like what he was, which was the boy's father, and a nurse named Philomena walked him back to the recovery bay and let him stand at the rail for as long as he wanted. Joanna arrived at 7 in the morning. She had driven behind the aircraft. Creighton had stayed at Ashbury Memorial because, he said, somebody had to manage the incident. The two of them, Gabriel and Joanna, stood on opposite sides of a bed with their child in it and did not say a word to each other for a long time. Then she said, "He told me he called you." And Gabriel said, "I know." And that was the entire conversation. And it was the beginning of the end of Joanna Deniston's marriage, and neither of them knew it yet. Dr. Gaynor came to find Gabriel on the second day. She was 41, direct to the point of bluntness, and she had the specific exhaustion of a pediatric surgeon who covers a 100-mile radius. She sat down on the windowsill because both chairs had people in them. She said, "I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it as information and not as ammunition." Gabriel said, "All right," she said. "If your son had come to me at 8 o'clock, I would have had a different operation to do. He would probably still have a spleen. That is not a promise, and it is not a certainty. And if anybody ever asks me to swear to it, I'll tell them the same thing. But you asked me what the delay cost, so that's the answer. It cost him an organ he was born with, and it very nearly cost him the whole thing." Then she said the sentence that turned Gabriel Waddell from a wrecked father into the man who walked into a board meeting. She said, "Can I ask you something? Why did a rural hospital with no pediatric surgeon hold a transected pancreas for 3 hours after my hospital had already accepted him?" And Gabriel Waddell, sitting in a plastic chair in a pediatric intensive care unit in Shelburne, Indiana, with his son's hand in his and both palms still scabbed from the gravel, realized that he did not know, and that he was going to. The first thing he did was the reasonable thing, and the reasonable thing failed completely. And I want to walk you through the failure because it is the most instructive part of this whole story. He called the hospital and asked for his son's records. He was entitled to them. He had joint legal custody and a decree that said so. He got them in 8 days, and they were complete, and they were useless. A chart tells you what was done. It does not tell you what was not done, or who decided not to do it. And the gap between 8:46 and 11:40 is, in the chart, simply a series of unremarkable entries about fluids and vital signs. Nobody writes holding Perseo in a medical record. He asked Dr. Jolliffe to talk to him. Dr. Jolliffe, on the advice of a lawyer he had retained within 72 hours of that night, would not. He asked Rachel Hendershot for the transfer packet timestamps, and she started to cry in the parking lot of the IGA and told him she could not, and he said, immediately, "Then don't. I should not have asked you," and he meant it, and he never asked her again. He called the State Department of Health and got a very polite young man who explained the complaint process and told him that as a family member, he could certainly file, and that he would not be told the outcome, and that these things take a while. And while Gabriel Waddell was doing all of that, from a shop apartment in Ottersville, with a son in Shelburne and a hospital bill accumulating in a drawer, Creighton Deniston was doing something much more efficient. On the 24th of October, 12 days after the accident, Creighton and Joanna's attorney filed a verified motion in Kinlow Circuit Court to suspend Gabriel Waddell's unsupervised parenting time pending a hearing, citing an act of physical aggression by the respondent on hospital property in the presence of the minor child's treating staff. Attached to it was a hospital security incident report, written the following morning by a guard who had been standing inside the glass, that described a confrontation on the front steps in which the respondent approached the chief executive officer in an agitated state and physical contact occurred. That report was not a lie, exactly. It was worse than a lie. Every noun in it was accurate and the verbs had been surgically removed. Physical contact occurred. Read that sentence again and notice that it does not contain a person doing anything. And the motion was filed as a verified motion, meaning Joanna had signed it. She had signed it in a lawyer's conference room on a day when her child had a drain coming out of his side and she had slept 10 hours in a week, and Creighton had put it in front of her and said, "This protects Jameson," and she had signed it, and she would tell Gabriel months later that she did not read past the first page, and Gabriel would believe her, because he had watched what that week did to her. The hearing was set for the 18th of November. Between the filing and the hearing, Gabriel Waddell was permitted to see his son at Shelburne Children's Hospital, only in the presence of a third adult. He complied, every single time. He drove 58 miles each way, 3 and 4 times a week, and he sat in a room with a court-appointed observer and read his son the same chapter of the same book, 7 nights running, because it was the one Jameson wanted, and he never once said one word about Creighton Deniston to that boy. Not one. That is the part of Gabriel Waddell I would like people to remember, more than what he did in the boardroom. Anybody can be dangerous when they are angry. Very few people can be that disciplined while somebody is standing between them and their kid. But he was not passive. What he was doing, in the truck, in the 58 miles each way, was thinking about the problem the way he thought about a piece of failed equipment, which was the only way he knew how to think about anything. A biomedical technician does not begin with who broke it. He begins with what the machine is required to do, and then he finds the place where the requirement and the behavior stop matching, and the fault is always, always at that seam. So Gabriel asked himself, what is that hospital required to do? And that question, sitting in a truck on a 2-lane road on the 9th of November, is the question that took him back to the tub on the shelf above the parts washer, because he had remembered something. Not a document, a person. He had remembered being 12 years old, in his grandmother's kitchen, listening to Almeda Waddell explain to a county commissioner at her own table, with a coffee cake between them, why she was not going to sell them the bottomland. He remembered exactly one line of it, in her voice, the way you remember one line out of a whole childhood. Then they can have it for $1, and I'll keep a key. Gabriel had thought, for 30 years, that this was his grandmother being folksy. He got home at 9 that night, went out to the shop, stood on a 5-gallon bucket, and took down the plastic tub. There were 3 certified envelopes in it, unopened, dated February of each of the last 3 years, plus a stack of older ones his mother had put there before him. He cut the first one open with a utility knife on the bench, under the work light, still in his coat. Inside was a cover letter from Frida Dillard, Director of Compliance, Kinlow Regional Health, which began, pursuant to Section 9(c) of the ground lease dated March 1962, please find enclosed the following current certifications and licenses of the facility. And behind that letter were 52 pages. The certificate of occupancy, the elevator certifications, the boiler inspection, the pharmacy license, the general and professional liability binders, the state hospital licensure certificate. And on page 31, the annual licensure renewal application filed with the Indiana State Department of Health, including Attachment C, Attestation of Service Capabilities, in which the licensee certifies the accuracy of each service line claimed by the facility. Attachment C listed, under Pediatric Services, Inpatient Pediatric Beds, 6. Pediatric Surgical Coverage, Continuous, 24 hours, by written arrangement. And at the bottom of Attachment C, on a line marked Signature of Chief Executive Officer, under a printed sentence certifying under penalty of perjury that the foregoing is true and correct, was a signature. Creighton Deniston. Gabriel Waddell stood in his shop at 10 o'clock at night, in his coat, with his hands still healing, and looked at that page for a long time. Then he cut open the other 2 envelopes, and there it was again. And again. The hospital's own compliance department had been mailing him this document, by certified mail, once a year, every year, because a nurse in 1962 had made a county attorney write a clause about it. Nobody had hidden anything. Nobody had needed to. They had put it in a certified envelope and handed it to the one man in Kinlow County who would know exactly what it meant, and they had done it because they were required to, and they had done it 3 years running while he left it in a tub above the parts washer. Now, what Gabriel Waddell had at that moment was not a weapon. I want to be careful about this, because it would be very satisfying to tell you that he found the smoking gun in an envelope and it was over. It was not over. What he had was one document making a claim, and no way at all to prove the claim was false. Attachment C said continuous pediatric surgical coverage by written arrangement. And there was a written arrangement. 2 general surgeons had signed it. On its face, everything matched. To break it, you would need the actual call schedules. You would need to show that on a given night, the arrangement covered nothing, that the surgeon on the sheet was on vacation, or in Florida, or was not credentialed in pediatrics at all, or that there were nights with no name on the line whatsoever. And call schedules are internal documents. No parent gets those. No plaintiff gets those without a lawsuit, discovery, and 18 months. Except Section 9 of a 99-year ground lease executed in March of 1962 says that upon written request, the lessee shall provide to the lessor, within 30 days, any records reasonably necessary to establish the facility's continuing compliance with the licensure representations delivered under 9-B. Almeda Waddell had not just asked for the certificates. She had asked for the right to check whether the certificates were true. She had done it because she had spent her life around men who signed things. And Section 9/ said the lessor or its designee shall be entitled to attend and be recognized at any meeting of the governing body of the facility. On the 17th of November, Gabriel Waddell walked into a title company in Ottersville, paid $19, and got a certified copy of the recorded lease. On the 18th, he sat in Kinlow Circuit Court while a magistrate watched 114 seconds of hospital security video and then asked the petitioner's attorney, in a tone that everybody in the room heard clearly, which party in this video would he say made physical contact with the other. The motion to suspend parenting time was denied from the bench. The magistrate ordered no findings and made no speech about it. She just denied it and called the next case, and that was that. Creighton Deniston was not in the courtroom. He had sent counsel. He never once, in the whole of this story, put himself in a room where he might have to answer a question in front of a stranger. On the 20th of November, Gabriel Waddell sent a letter. He did not write it angry. He wrote it, in fact, in the flattest, most administrative language he could manage, and he had a lawyer in Shelburne named Valeria Quesenberry look at it for $200, and her only edit was to take out the one sentence where his feelings had leaked through. The letter went to the Secretary of the Board of Kinlow Regional Health, copied to the Director of Compliance, and to the Chief Executive Officer. It said that Waddell Field Company, LLC, as lessor under the ground lease of March 1962, hereby made written request under Section 9/ for the following records for the preceding 26 months: the daily surgical call schedules for the facility, the credentialing files evidencing pediatric privileges for each provider appearing on those schedules, and the facility's transfer log for all patients under 18 years of age. And in the final paragraph it said that the undersigned, as designee of the lessor under Section 9/ would attend the regular meeting of the board on the 9th of December. Frida Dillard, Director of Compliance, read that letter at her desk at 7:40 in the morning, and went very still. Frida Dillard was 44 years old and had been in compliance for 13 years, and compliance officers are a particular breed. They are the people whose entire job is to say the unwelcome sentence early. She had, on 2 previous occasions, put something in writing to Creighton Deniston about the pediatric coverage arrangement. Both times she had been told it was a documentation issue and that the attorneys were comfortable. Both of those memos existed. She walked the letter up to Creighton's office herself. He read it standing up. And then Creighton Deniston made the second of the 3 mistakes that ended him, which was that he laughed. He said, "Frida, this is a man who is angry about a custody case and has found a piece of paper from before the moon landing. Send him the schedules. Send him all of it. It'll be 1,000 pages and he'll never open it." Which was, in its way, a completely rational read. It was also the exact same mistake he had made on the front steps, wearing different clothes. He had priced the man in front of him without ever asking what the man did for a living. Frida Dillard sent the records on the 6th of December. She sent them because Section 9 SOT required her to, and because she had already had 2 memos ignored and had no intention of having a third. She sent 1,206 pages, unredacted. Meanwhile, something else had been moving that nobody in the executive suite knew about. On the 3rd of November, Ernestine Ruffner had filed a complaint. She had not talked to Gabriel Waddell. She has never, to this day, met him for longer than the length of a hallway. She filed because on the 28th of October, a girl of 7 had come into that emergency department with a scald burn over her chest and shoulder, and Ernestine had watched the same slow ballet begin. The workup, the wait, the cart, the phrase, "let's not fly her if we don't have to." And she had gone home that night and sat in her car in her own driveway with the engine off for 20 minutes. Then she went inside and typed a complaint to the state and attached to it a photograph of a whiteboard taken at 9 o'clock on the 12th of October, on which someone had written, in blue marker, "Accepted. Hold per admin." And when the state received a complaint alleging that a hospital had delayed a transfer of an unstable pediatric patient after acceptance, the state was required to do a thing that has no discretion in it at all. It notified the federal regional office, and a survey team began to assemble, on a timeline that nobody at Ashbury Memorial could see, hear, or influence. 2 engines were now turning, and Creighton Deniston did not know that either of them existed. Gabriel Waddell spent 72 hours with those 1,200 pages spread across the floor of a shop apartment above a parts washer, with a space heater going, and his son asleep in the other room, home from Shelburne, with a drain site still healing. He did not read them like a lawyer. He read them like a technician doing an acceptance test, which means you do not read for meaning, you read for the seam. He took the surgical call schedules for 26 months and he made a grid. Down the side, every date. Across the top, 1 column. Who is the pediatric surgical coverage tonight? Then he took the credentialing files and, for each surgeon whose name appeared, he found the page listing that provider's granted privileges. Both general surgeons had a long list of privileges. Neither list contained a single pediatric line item. Dr. Jolliffe's file actually had a note in it, from the medical staff office, from 2 years earlier, reading, "Requested Peds Gen Surge privileges, deferred pending case log." Then he took the transfer log and matched it, night by night, to the schedule. What came out of that grid was the fact that ended it. Over the 26 months, there were 79 nights on which the surgical call line for the facility listed no surgeon at all. The entry read, "Per agreement," and named the Indianapolis Telemedicine Group, which does not have surgeons and has never claimed to. There were another 519 nights on which the named surgeon held no pediatric privileges of any kind, and in the specific 26 nights before his son went over the handlebars, 17 of them had no pediatric surgical coverage that would survive being said out loud in a room. Continuous, 24 hours, by written arrangement, and then, on page 890 of a stack that nobody had redacted, because Creighton Deniston had told them not to bother, Gabriel found something he had not even been looking for: the executive scorecard. A single laminated page, reproduced in the board packet of the previous March, on which the operational metrics of the facility were listed with a color beside each one. Pediatric admissions, green, arrow up. Pediatric transfers out, red, arrow up. Annotated, in the small print at the bottom, target, reduce. He sat back on the floor of that shop with a cold cup of coffee and understood that he was not looking at a man who had made a bad call on one Saturday night. He was looking at a man who had built a machine that would make that call every Saturday night forever, and who had then signed his name under penalty of perjury to a description of a hospital that did not exist. The regular meeting of the Board of Kinlow Regional Health convened at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 9th of December, in the Almeida Waddell Conference Room on the ground floor of Ashbury Memorial Hospital. Yes, that is the room's actual name. It had been named for her in 1996, and there is a small brass plate by the door, and nobody in that building had thought about the plate in years, including, obviously, the man who ran it. There were 7 board members. The chair was Augusta Godby, 71, retired superintendent of the Ottersville schools, who had chaired that board for 8 years, and who ran a meeting the way she had run a district, which is to say she started on time. Beside her was Wilford Colquitt, 78, who had run the grain elevator for 30 years and who had been on the board since before Creighton Denniston finished high school. Creighton was at the far end with the chief financial officer and Hamilton Inglis, the chief operating officer, on either side of him. Frida Dillard sat against the wall in the second row of chairs with a folder in her lap and had told nobody what was in it. At 6:02, the door opened, and a man in a clean canvas jacket walked in carrying a document tube and a laptop bag. Creighton Denniston looked up, and for a moment his face did the thing faces do when the context is wrong, the moment where you see the mechanic in the concert hall. He half stood, and he said, "Sir, this is a closed meeting of the—" And Gabriel Waddell set the tube on the table and said, "Good evening. I'm the man who owns the ground this building is standing on, and under Section 9 stash of the lease your hospital signed with my grandmother in 1962, I've had a seat at this table since before any of you were on this board. My name is Gabriel Waddell. This room is named after her." Augusta Godby looked at the brass plate on the wall, then at the certified copy of the lease that Gabriel slid across the table, then at the hospital's own general counsel, who read the 2 highlighted paragraphs, and who said, in a voice with all the air gone out of it, "Madam Chair, that provision is valid. He's entitled to be recognized." They tell me that is the moment Creighton Denniston went white. Not later, when the grid came out of the tube. Right then, in the first 15 seconds, when a man he had shoved into a gravel bed was recognized by the chair. Because Creighton was smart, and he had already gotten to the end of it. Gabriel Waddell spoke for 19 minutes and never raised his voice once. He did not talk about his son at the start. He started with Attachment C, and he put a copy in front of every board member, and he asked whether any of them had seen it before. None of them had. He explained what it certified and who had signed it, and what the phrase "under penalty of perjury" does. Then he unrolled the grid, 26 months across the wall of that conference room, night by night, in a technician's block printing. Green squares for nights with genuine pediatric surgical coverage. Red squares for nights without. It was overwhelmingly red, and every board member in that room could read a calendar. Then he laid the credentialing pages beside it. Then the executive scorecard, with pediatric transfers out in red, and the words "target," "reduce." And only then, at the very end, did he put down one more page, the transfer log for the night of the 12th of October, showing Shelburne's acceptance at 8:46 and wheels up at 11:40. And he said, "That is my son. He is 9. He lost his spleen. I'm not asking this board for anything about him. He has his own remedies, and I'll pursue them somewhere else. I'm here as your landlord, and what I'm telling you is that the certification hanging in your lobby describes a hospital you do not have, and that the man who signed it built a scorecard rewarding people for not sending children to the ones who do." Wilford Colquitt, 78 years old, took his glasses off and said, to nobody in particular, "Well, my God." Frida Dillard stood up from the second row and said, "Madam Chair, I have 2 memoranda on this subject that I'd like to enter." And that was the end of Creighton Denniston. The board went into executive session at 7:20 and stayed in it until nearly midnight. Gabriel Waddell was not in the room for that. He had said what he came to say, and he drove home and sat on the end of his son's bed and watched him breathe. Creighton Denniston was placed on administrative leave that night, and terminated for cause 19 days later. For cause is not a phrase about feelings. It is a phrase about money. It voided his severance. It voided the retention award he had been due in March. And it converted an unvested long-term incentive of just under $2.9 million into nothing at all. In a single vote, in a room with a brass plate by the door. The state survey team arrived on the 15th of January, unannounced, at 6 in the morning, as they do. They surveyed for 5 days. Ashbury Memorial was cited, placed under a plan of correction, and given a deadline. And it met the deadline, and it kept its license, which matters, and which Gabriel Waddell wanted, and which he had said out loud in that meeting before he unrolled anything. The hospital hired an actual pediatric transfer protocol with an actual clock in it. Acceptance to wheels up, 30 minutes. No administrative approval required from anybody, ever, for a patient under 18. It is on the wall of that emergency department now, in a frame, where everyone can see it. The attestation went somewhere else. A false certification signed by a chief executive under penalty of perjury is not a hospital problem. It is a person problem. The referral went out in February. Creighton Denniston, on the advice of counsel, agreed in the following autumn to a voluntary exclusion from participation in federal healthcare programs for a period of 5 years, which, translated out of the language it is written in, means that no hospital, no nursing home, no clinic, no hospice, and no insurer in the United States can employ him in any capacity and still get paid. He was 48 years old. He had spent his entire working life in one industry, and he was removed from it, not by a lawsuit, and not by a headline, but by a form he had signed himself, every year, in a quiet office, without reading it. Joanna filed in March. She did not do it because of the board meeting. She did it because in the packet of records that Frida Dillard had sent, unredacted, there was a copy of the transfer log with the acceptance time on it, and Joanna Denniston sat at the kitchen table on Kettering Street with that page and finally understood what those 3 hours had been, and who had spent them, and on what. She and Gabriel did not get back together. I know that is the ending some of you want, and it is not the one that happened. What they got, over about a year, was something that is honestly rarer. 2 people who could sit in the same waiting room at a follow-up appointment and split a bag of vending machine pretzels and talk about their kid. Jamison Waddell is doing fine. He takes a vaccine schedule that most children do not, because of the spleen, and he will for life. He is back on the bicycle. His father put new grips on it himself and checked the bar ends, and did not say why. Almost a year after the 12th of October, on a Tuesday, Gabriel Waddell was lying on his back on the floor of a patient room in a small hospital 2 counties over, with a bed frame partly disassembled and a drive motor in his hand, when his phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. It was a voicemail from a number in Kinlow County that he did not recognize. A woman's voice, tired, a little formal, the way people are when they are talking to a machine. She said she had gotten this number from somebody at the hospital and she hoped it was the right one. She said her daughter had gone off the pad at Ashbury Memorial 22 minutes after they walked in the door, and that the girl was going to be all right, and that a nurse had told her there had been a change in how they do it now, and that somebody had made them change it. She said, "I don't know who you are. I just wanted to say thank you to somebody." Gabriel Waddell lay on the floor of that patient room with the phone against his ear and the drive motor resting on his chest, and he listened to it twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket, and he finished the bed, because it was a Tuesday, and there were 3 more on his list. Here is what I keep turning over about this one, and it is not the least. Watch what a man does to somebody he is certain cannot touch him. That is not rudeness. That is not a bad night. That is a specification. Creighton Denniston, on those steps, told everyone in that parking lot exactly how his hospital treated any person it had decided was a category rather than a name, and he did it out loud, on camera, in about a second and a half, because he had priced the man in front of him and gotten the number wrong. He had done the same arithmetic on a whole county for 3 years. He had looked at children coming through his emergency department and seen a line on a scorecard. That is the same act. The steps were just the version of it small enough to fit in a security video. So I would say this, and I would say it to the people who are the Creightons of their own small worlds as much as anybody. The person you are talking past, at the loading dock, in the parking lot, on the night shift, in the work jacket, is very often the only person in your building who knows what it actually does at 3 in the morning. You are not being generous when you learn their name. You are being accurate. Almeida Waddell knew that in 1962, which is why she would not take the money. She took $1 a year and a key instead, and she handed both of them down to a grandson she would never see grown. And it took 63 years, and a boy on a bicycle for anybody to turn it. I'm Nathan.